Hopefully, by thinking about the I didn't do the work example in the poll, you're hopefully realizing that there's a benefit to something called desirable difficulties. Now, in teaching and learning, we come at this of learning should be challenging, that should be a productive struggle. Now, we don't want students to struggle regardless. We want it to be meaningful. And the point of this is that there has to be a struggle. It can't be too easy and it can't be too hard. So therefore we talk about the Goldilocks effect, where learning is just right. We've triggered that level of challenge where students are working hard to remember and retain that information, but we're not overwhelming them and making it too challenging. I think one of the key things, though, that comes out of this from desirable difficulties, and if you want to research more on this, you can look at the work of Bjork and Bjork. When you learn something, the only way you really know you have learned it is when you check what you've learned. And I think it's important to remind students that self-testing is really important, be that handwriting and then covering it up and trying to remember what was written down, or be that a quick quiz. It's about that self-testing so that they know where they're at and where they need to go to next. Because if you don't know where your learning is at, you can't plan the next steps of your learning. So from the work of Bjork and Bjork, we sort of know students should be encouraged to self-test as much as possible. One of the main things they're asked to do is to sort of summarise the key points of a lecture. And the reason for that is when you're in a lecture, there's so much information coming at you. Today as well is a prime example. A lot of information is coming at you. Hopefully, Lee telling you the slides are coming at the end relieves some of that pressure and you're like, cool, I don't need to take as many detailed notes because I know the slides are coming. But obviously I want to still try and remember some of this. And that's because your brain's constantly struggling with this 3 to 5 situation. It can only pick up 3 to 5 bits of new information at once before it has to drop it down. And it takes a few seconds to make that decision. And every time it makes that decision, it's building a pathway from what you're learning into your long-term memory. And the whole purpose of learning is to build those strong pathways. I often liken it to, if I asked you to remember visiting a beach and having a drink or a meal at a beach bar somewhere in your previous life, the weather's grim today, let's all picture somewhere warm. I think you will remember, hopefully, the people you were with, the beach you were at, maybe what you ate, maybe what you drank, maybe you might even remember what you were wearing, or I'd certainly remember what my kids were wearing. Um, but you won't remember how many people were on the beach. You won't remember how many people were sat on their towels. You won't remember the sounds of people on the beach. You won't remember that they were playing with the ball over there and they were playing with a frisbee over there, because your brain's forgotten all that information. It's focused on the important bit. It's built that strong neural pathway for you to remember that lovely memory later, and it's focused on what was important. And that, in essence, is what we're doing with learning. Unfortunately, though, students tend to think they know what they're doing, and the idea of self-testing is really quite hard for students because they don't want that challenge. They don't want to feel that it's challenging because they're scared that it might be really hard or too hard. So we sort of almost have to make what we call self-testing low stakes. Like, it's not important. A high stakes test is something like a GCSE or something like an end of term exam that's going to carry towards your final grade. We're not saying that. What we're saying is a quick quiz or a quick check on what you can remember is the only way you're going to know how much you put into your long-term memory. And the research and the science tells us the more that you retrieve things from your long-term memory and bring them back out, the stronger those pathways become. Now, what happens generally is students prefer to do things that are a little bit easier. So they prefer to do reading, lots of reading, reread the information time and time again. And so they wrongly think that they've become fluent in something because they've read it 3 times. But actually, unless they assess what they've learned, they don't really know how much of that they've taken in. And when students purely rely on what they've read or how confident they are with the fluency, They get an illusion of competence, we call it in science. And this is, you can look up Kapiki or Rodiger. There's lots of theory and science and experiments that have gone behind this, that this is proven time and time again. And I think, we all recognize that if there was a less challenging path, we might prefer that. But for learning, it's really important that there is an element of challenge and that an assessment happens as we go through. So you need to know what you've learned and what is still to be learned. So we need to balance this though. We don't want it to be too challenging, and we don't want things to distract from the good work that we're trying to do of building those neural pathways. So if we look at something like dual coding theory from Pavio or Mayer's multimedia theory, what they talk about in those theories is remove unproductive things, remove the noise, remove extra images. If I read word for word what was on these slides now, there's redundant information that's happening. Either my words being spoken or the words on the slides are becoming redundant. So it's taking the brain away from what it should be focusing on. So we need to cut down that and focus on what's important. And in order to do that, we then maximize the signal. So we maximize the things that we need to do, the concepts that we're trying to understand. And students have to do the heavy lifting. They have to synthesize that information. What we know when we encode information, so when we learn new information and we encode it, the whole purpose is so that we can retrieve it later and have it as knowledge. But whenever we encode something and put it in that long-term memory, the brain is working really hard to connect it to things we already know. And the more we make meaning of the things that we're learning that are new to things we already know, the stronger that neural pathway gets. So you've got the challenge element, you've got the need to prioritize getting the information in, and then you've got the need to connect that information to what you already know. And the brain's doing all this in a few seconds every single time. So we really need to work on how do we maximize that signal to give students the best possible chance. And I cover all of this without mentioning AI. That is just science. Like, that is learning science. That is bread and butter of teaching and learning. It is stuff that I've been working with for a decade or more now. And then we have AI coming in, and AI sort of can help us feel a little bit more confident because it makes things a little bit more easier. However, the rules still apply, and we're now seeing lots and lots of science coming out that backs this up as well. So the passive learning of reading information and thinking that you've learned it, before AI wasn't really good for learning. With AI, it's still not really going to be good for learning because they're not engaging with the material. They're not being able to connect it to what they already know, and they're not testing that knowledge. We're seeing as well from studies that students then overestimate their skills when they've used AI, and that again, students prefer the more efficient path. They prefer the path of AI because they think it's more efficient for them, and they think it's an easier way to get to the end goal that they're trying to get to. Now, AI is brilliant in making things more accessible and removing barriers and getting people started. I personally struggle with task initiation, so I find it very beneficial for me there. But there are levels to AI and there are levels to need, and it's about finding the right level of AI for the need of the students really now. And then just recently, I think it was maybe a couple of weeks ago, Lee, I can't remember exactly, but the UK government came out with some AI standards. Now, these are standards, these are not guidelines. So although they're not enforced yet, they will be. And the government floated them and they published them now. So these are to be met by edtech providers going forward. Now, obviously, these apply to schools and colleges in the main, but they do also apply to universities as well, because the UK government looks after all of the education in this country. And the government has pointed out all these things, and the government has said we need to mitigate against the cognitive de-skilling. So we need to make sure that AI doesn't give students the answer. We need to make sure that the students are doing the learning in order for the product or the edtech product to be used. And I think that's going to be really challenging for how we position, some solutions that have been around. And the government have asked that edtech providers like us have friction by design. So we have to create opportunities for students to enter that desirable difficulties phase to achieve that Goldilocks state. Offering students complete worked examples, should not be given. They should be given hints and tips and guidance, and students should be guided towards that point, but not given those answers. And really explicitly, the government has said that any time cognitive offloading happens, so the thinking is offloaded to the AI or the doing of the student is offloaded to AI, it must be explicitly stated. And like I said, these standards are not enforced yet, but they have been published, so we are expecting them to be enforced soon. And the government is being guided by the research of the learning science, like I've mentioned before, that's been around for decades and decades and decades. But also, we have emerging research on AI now. We are 3 years into this world of large language models being freely available to everyone. So scientists and academics have been researching it. And I just want to draw your attention to a particular study. And again, it is linked in the slides. But this study was really interesting to me. And this was a study of 30 students, and they were given 3 different types of notes after a lecture. And so they had the same lecture, and they were given 3 different types of AI, and the first one being minimal AI, and that's transcription. So they're given a transcript of the lecture. And it's important to recognise that that's how long AI has been around. Whenever we've used transcripts, we've been using AI. We've just not maybe called it AI, or we've maybe not recognised it as AI as much, but that is AI. So the minimal was transcription. The intermediate was short summaries. So the summaries happened and they were sort of broken up and given little summary sections as they went through the lecture. And then the automated AI was just a spit out page of this is everything that happened in the lecture. And what happened was they monitored the cognitive load of the students. So when we talk about that 3 to 5 second rule, and we talk about 3 to 5 bits of information and 20-second rule, that's cognitive load, managing what's in the brain, making sure it gets into the long-term memory quickly and easily. Those that had the transcription blocks worked really hard. They had high extraneous load, and unfortunately, that's the load we don't really want. That's the load of tasks that aren't really adding to learning, but they're difficult to do. So it was hard work for those students. The intermediate AI, so those that got summary blocks, had high germane load. Now that is the good cognitive load. That means you are learning and doing, and it's going into your long-term memory, and your brain's managing it really well, and you've reached that high level of load and that desirable difficulty. The automated, so the page summary of the lecture, low cognitive load and low engagement. There wasn't much active participation going on by the students when they were reading that. Interestingly, students thought that the minimal AI was really trustworthy, but they found it really hard. The intermediate AI they liked because it helped them stay focused, and the automated AI, the summary, they loved it because it was low effort. And I think, hopefully I've proven that we've seen this for many years in the science, that that's what students prefer. But this is the bit for me, and this is the bit about learning. When they were then tested on the content of that lecture after they were given these 3 lots of AI, they'd monitored their cognitive load, they'd monitored their thoughts and feelings, and then they monitored their performance in a test of remembering what was in that lecture. The students who had minimal AI did okay. The students who had intermediate AI, the summaries, did the best. The students who had the automated AI did the worst. So I come back to, it's about finding the right level of AI for the right students that's in front of you. And hopefully the science has sort of explained where we come from with that.